war is the most destructive and horrible of all human activity on the planet. When we're deciding how we're going to respond to it, when there's overseas conflicts for the United States especially, the first thing that we need is accurate information. The last thing that we need is misinformation. Generals, admirals keep telling us things that it sounds so compelling and so strong, and yet when you compare it to the actual ground truth reality, there's the gulf between is just unmanageable. And now then today we have another one. Now this one is by the just resigned Minister of Defense of the United Kingdom, Ben Wallace. And he just published a piece a couple of days ago in the Telegraph on Sunday called "Ukraine is Winning. Now let's finish the job." Here's how he opens the article itself. "Whisper it if you need. Dare to think it, but champion it if you must. Ukraine's counteroffensive is succeeding. Slowly but surely, the Ukrainian armed forces are breaking through Russian lines, sometimes yard by yard, sometimes village by village. Ukraine has the momentum and is pressing forward." Look, it doesn't take any kind of a rocket scientist or military expert to understand that no, Ukraine is not winning. As a matter of fact, if you look at the amount of terrain that has changed hands in Ukraine since January 1st of this year, you'll see that, in fact, it is Russia, not Ukraine, who has gained more territory. So graphically speaking, no matter how you want to say it, clearly Ukraine is not winning. They are not having momentum, and there's no end in sight that we need to press on toward the end. But now this is nothing new for Ben Wallace. He's been really consistently saying this no matter what's happening on the ground. Now, it started last year, about 7 months ago, in September of 2022, when the Ukraine had its actual one genuine big offensive success when they had an offensive in Kherson and in Kharkiv oblasts. And during that time in September, he said this:
President Putin's breaking of his own promises not to mobilize parts of his population and the illegal annexation of parts of Ukraine are an admission that his invasion is failing. He and his defense minister have sent tens of thousands of their own citizens to their deaths. Ill-equipped and badly led, no amount of threats and propaganda can hide the fact that Ukraine is winning this war.
So you see, that's a common thing that he's been saying for a long time. Ukraine is winning this war. Now, at the time, if that's the only clip you had at the moment he said it, you can say, okay, well, they actually did make a good move here, and perhaps they're going to go on and win. Although, as I said at the time, and as in many publications and in television news appearances, that yes, that was a big move by Ukraine, but the fundamentals still favor Russia. So the British secretary should not have been telling people even then that, yeah, Ukraine is winning, because they weren't. They had a good battle. They caught Russia by surprise, and they made big gains, especially in the north. But that was not going to translate into war. Now, in February of this year, he continued on with that theme, and this is now heading into what we know is going to be an offensive. What he knew more than anyone else was going to be offensive. And in February, at the 1-year anniversary of the war, he said this:
Britain is going to be there to the end with Ukraine. We're going to follow it through. We're going to keep standing by them. We will do all the things we can to help them succeed in making sure that Putin fails in Ukraine.
And so now then, on the very eve of the offensive in May, he's going to come again and he's going to make another comment. And he's going to say another thing about how optimistic he is. Now, this is right before the offensive is going to launch. And let me remind you that I had been talking about forever, and I think we've even talked about it in previous episodes of Deep Dive, that even at that time, I was warning, do not do this. Do not launch this offensive, because it has very low chances of success, and it has a high chance of absolutely failing and costing Ukraine a great deal. So from my perch 6,000 miles away, I have no access to classified information. The British secretary has access to every classified information that there is. And so I'm warning, don't do this. It's not going to work. And he's still telling you this.
Including the United Kingdom, and now I saw from the announcement in Germany, stepping up more and more to make sure Ukraine has success on the battlefield so it can negotiate, if it wishes to, from a position of strength.
Now, so he's trying to tell everybody, heading into this offensive, it's going to be so successful that now then Kiev is going to have a chance to negotiate an end to the war from a position of strength. Now, that was a common theme that was going through at the time that the offensive, they wanted to be able to negotiate from strength. But that was nonsense from the beginning because, I mean, just think about it. Zelensky from day one has always said he wants every inch of Ukrainian territory back, to include Crimea. So what possible rationale could anyone make that same Zelensky is going to say, okay, actually, we just want a little bit of success here, and then we're going to negotiate an into strength, meaning from position of strength, but with Russia still in Ukraine, we're going to negotiate away. He would never do that. If he had any success at all he would do is press further and be even more committed to doing his to achieving his goal of complete eradication of Russian forces from his country. But of course, that's not what happened. Now, Wallace is still not finished, and instead of dealing with reality he knew beforehand, now that you think maybe after 2 months of complete disaster in the offensive, where everything that the West had done, all this half a year of preparation that had been done ahead of time, that now then he's going to at least moderate what he says. But instead, 2 months into the offensive, he adds this.
There is no more immediate threat than Russia. Its full-scale invasion of Ukraine was not simply an assault on a proud and sovereign nation. It was an attack on all our values, on European security and the open international order on which stability and prosperity have depended for over 3/4 of a century. Today, right now, the people of Ukraine are suffering the tragic consequences of President Putin's illegal, unprovoked invasion, his naked aggression and imperial ambitions played out in a tragedy of epic human suffering.
Okay, so now it seems that the secretary is going to change track, and now then, okay, the war is not going to go. The offensive is not going well, so they're not going to be able to negotiate an end to the war on terms favorable to Kiev. And so now then we got to make sure we don't lose the support of the Western audience. So now then we're going to switch track to an emotional track. And you heard that last sentence there where he hit a lot of the key emotional words that many of the leaders are using, that Putin was this naked aggression, that he was unprovoked, and that he was has imperial ambitions and trying intentionally to align with what was the case with Hitler, meaning that if we don't stop him here, he's going to continue to roll west and take other NATO countries, first the Baltics and maybe then Poland, and then he's coming for us all. That's the implication, because that's what those things mean, and they want to generate fear that this has happened before, and now then he's the new manifestation of it. Now, as I've told you again many times, that's nonsense, because Russia doesn't have the capacity to do so. Even if he had those desires and those ambitions, it doesn't matter, because he doesn't have the physical infrastructure and capacity in terms of tanks, airplanes, logistics systems, ammunition, manpower to actually go past Ukraine. Look, if you need any more proof, just look at a map and you'll see that after 19 months of war, the most he's gotten is one car, like a banana-shaped strip of the one country with no allies on his border. That's all he can get. So you can see he doesn't even have the capacity to go much more in Ukraine. He definitely doesn't have the capacity to go into the rest of NATO. So that just proves that there is no threat from that. But yet that's the illusion that the Secretary Wallace is wanting to pass along. But now we also know that his claim is simply untrue, and he knows it's untrue because the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, last month let this slip.
First of all, it is historic that now Finland is a member of the alliance. And we have to remember the background. The background was that President Putin declared in the autumn of 2021, and he actually sent a draft treaty that he wanted NATO to sign to promise no more NATO enlargement. That was what he sent us. And that was a precondition for not invade Ukraine. Of course, we didn't sign that.
Okay, so you see, just straight up, he said, we knew at the time, ergo, Wallace knew at the time, that war could have been avoided if only they had just said, okay, we're not going to bring NATO up to your border. All we had to do is negotiate with it. Putin clearly told them behind the scenes in direct terms, as Stoltenberg just confirmed to you right before your eyes, that if you bring NATO up to our border, then we're going to war. And if you take NATO off the table, then we won't go to war. I mean, he point blank said this. So this was not imperial ambition. This is not some drive to or desire to go into Western Europe or to attack NATO. It's none of those things. Putin genuinely is interested in his border security because he is terrified of NATO. Understand that. This is about fear of Putin. He is terrified of NATO. He's not wanting to conquer it because he knows he can't. So we can use that fear for our benefit. We could have used it there to make sure there was no war, because the biggest thing he feared is what we said, yeah, we're going to do it anyway, and we don't care what you say. And we have what we have now. Now, undeterred by every bit of that, now we get back to Wallace's current piece in the Telegraph here. And on Sunday, one of the key things he said in here was he was, first of all, talking about his complaints that people are now understandably in the West talking about, do we really want to keep supporting this indefinitely because the offensive didn't work? And what's the rational logic that somehow that's going to change in the future when everything seems to be improving on the Russian side and falling apart on the Ukraine side? And about those complaints, he said, but what these people failed to grasp was the importance of the human factor. They failed to spot in the Ukrainian the same spirit we possessed in 1939. They failed to recall Alan Turig's quote that, quote, sometimes it is the people no one can imagine anything of who do the things no one can imagine, end quote. They failed to understand that in war, the most precious commodity of all is hope. Now, look, let me just tell you, no. The most precious commodity in war is a well-trained force with experience, well-equipped, with a logistics system able to sustain a war that they have a shot at winning. That's the most precious commodity. It's the men who are trained and experienced and then given the tools they need. If you don't have that, then it doesn't matter how much hope you have. And I argue it is actually immoral to say, look, despite all of the fundamentals not being there, all the things that the principles of war and the history of warfare and just a simple analysis of what actually takes place in war, even though none of those are in your favor, and all the ones that presage future results on the battlefield continue to accelerate for the Russian side, we want you Ukrainians to keep fighting, and we'll keep giving you bullets and rockets and everything else so that you can keep fighting, even though there is no logical, rational path to military success. And to then tell that people, you just need to have hope. It's like us in 1939. No, it's not. It is nothing like 1939. In 1939, first of all, UK actually had some allies. So they were not by themselves. They had allies, and they were trying to get us to come into the war on their side. And of course, we know that later on happens. But even at that time, they were separated by the English Channel. They had some allies, and they had plenty of people that were helping them. And it was going to be very, very difficult for Nazi Germany to cross the Channel. And as we know, they were never able to do it. They didn't even launch such an offensive operation. And now then, he's trying to tell the Ukraine people who have, it's the equivalent of if the Nazis had a third or a fifth of UK, that they were already in their soil in 1939 and that they resisted and somehow pushed them out. That's not what happened. So you can't make that analogy. It's grossly inaccurate because UK was never invaded by the Nazis and they had allies. So you can't say that, because to tell the Ukraine people, hey, we did this in 1939 because we had hope. Yeah, you had hope, and also the English Channel. Ukraine doesn't have that. They're already invaded. They've already lost potentially upwards of 500,000 people. By 1939, the UK had lost probably in the tens of thousands, and that's it. And actually, by that time, it wasn't even that many. So again, any way you want to measure it, that analogy is terrible, and it's immoral, because all it does is increase the suffering and the loss of the people of Ukraine. I just cannot more strongly reiterate this. If you don't have a viable military path, even a reasonable one, even if it's like a 30% chance, maybe that's enough. If there's a 30% shot that maybe if things fall your way that you can succeed here and there's a rational path to it, then maybe that's a choice that people want to make. But when there is a 1 or 2% chance, and that's just something, leaving room for a black swan event or something that no one can even imagine unexpectedly happens, that's you can never rule that completely out. But it's like the 98% probability that Ukraine doesn't have the capacity to win this war, and to tell them that they need to have hope and to continue fighting despite all of the things they see is to make it almost certain that more Ukrainians die, more cities are wiped off the map, and ultimately they lose more territory before they're forced to make a negotiated settlement out of weakness to where they're almost at terms of surrender. That's more likely than what Secretary Wallace is suggesting with fighting. And I think that we owe it to the Ukrainian people, we owe it to the American people to be honest about the actual conditions. Because again, just imagine this. Today is, what is this, October the 3rd, 2023. And right now, Ukraine still possesses Odessa and access to the Black Sea. They still possess Kharkiv city and all the territory from the current line of contact to the west. Now, if they continue to follow in the path that Wallace and many others in the West and other leaders and American leaders in the U.S. Congress, for example, continue to say, some of these generals that we've talked about before, that they keep fighting, I suspect that there's a higher chance that in the future that many of these things they have today, they won't have. And so the longer you wait to have a negotiated settlement, the less land that they're going to have. And then you have to ask, subsequent to that, what is the best hope to offer the Ukrainian people? What's the most moral thing we can do to help them? Is it to say, hey, you can't win this war. Let's negotiate the best deal you can get so you hang on to everything you have and you continue to have a political and economic lifeline to the West, because that can be negotiated, as opposed to blindly ignoring all those things and then the future coming out that potentially they lose the war and have to accept terms of surrender, basically. Who's helping? Who's going to succeed in that? Who's going to benefit from that? And I argue it's not the Ukrainian people. Something you need to think about there. We'll see you next time on Deep Dive. Thanks for being here.